At Teachers College at Columbia, and this is joint work with Feng Hu of the University of Science and Technology Beijing, or Beikeda if you speak Mandarin. Feng is a frequent collaborator of mine. We did my job market paper together, and we've got a lot of other stuff in the pipeline, and we're very excited to get all of your feedback on this. So in a sentence, today's talk is about information and its role in the formation of human capital. So we know that as children go through life, they learn about themselves and the world from what they come in contact with. So first, their parents, and when they get to school, peers, teachers, later the media. And as economists, we care about this because it forms some economic fundamentals in adulthood, namely beliefs and preferences. The role of information in informing investment decisions has been well studied in finance, in the labor market, but also in the formation of human capital. And in the formation of human capital, because it's characterized by dynamic complementarity, which means that investments in early stages influence the per unit investment in all later stages, there's great potential for early misinformation to generate a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the motivating case for the talk is to imagine a girl who arrives in first grade and meeting someone on the playground is holding a math book. And she hears from that person on the playground, "Why are you doing that? You know that girls are good at English and boys are good at math." And in the setting that we're going to study today, China, as well as in the US and lots of other places, this is a very commonly held belief. What we're worried about is that this generates a negative pathway. So hearing that information, the girl internalizes it. And the principle of comparative advantage suggests that that's going to lead her to be more likely to exert effort and be enthusiastic about her language arts homework and tests and classes relative to her math tests and homework and classes. Now what we're worried about is, again, because of dynamic complementarity, she's going to exert less effort on math. She's going to get a negative signal from her performance evaluations in math because she hasn't exerted much effort. And because math builds on itself, when she faces harder math homework questions, which build on the stuff that she was supposed to have learned in earlier periods, she'll get further information that suggests she's not good at math, thus bearing out what was potentially misinformation at the beginning of this process. So what we're interested in doing in this paper is understanding a particular means of preventing against these persistent effects of quote-unquote bad information. And in particular, we're interested in the potential for role models to protect against this causal pathway. The question we're going to ask is what the information content is of a teacher who shares an identity with you in a way that will be made clear in a few slides. And we're going to ask how that information content varies with the student's beliefs about herself. So the context that we're going to focus on is Chinese middle schools. And this is useful to us for two reasons. The first reason is, like in the US, there's widespread belief that girls are worse than boys in mathematics, in contradiction of fact. So in the data that we have, as well as in other data sets, girls do at least as well as boys in math assessments in the first 95 percentiles. In addition to that, in Chinese middle schools, because of a law passed in the mid-aughts, there's random assignment of students to different classrooms. And this gives us a kind of Pandora's box of experiments that we can use to understand causal mechanisms. So my co-authors use this to study the peer effects in Chinese classrooms. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this to give us as good as random assignment of teacher gender to student gender. We're going to exploit this to test a series of predictions from a simple model based on a paper that came out earlier this year in Econometrica, which studies aspirations and forward-looking investment decisions under imperfect information. The questions we're going to ask is how being dosed with a positive, credible role model affects low perceived ability students' beliefs and aspirations, their investment in their own human capital, and their performance on math examinations. what we find is that being assigned a female math teacher brings large benefits for low perceived ability girls specifically. So these girls, if assigned to a female math teacher, are much less likely, please, there.
Perceived by who?
Perceived by themselves. So I'll make that clear in the data, but the basic idea is they're asked, how difficult did you find math in 6th grade? And that's what we're going to use to separate these two. And that could be the result of all sorts of things, but for our purposes...
Well, I just want to know if it was a self-assessment or a teacher assessment. I want to know who was doing the perceiving.
That's a good question. Self-perceived. By the way, please interrupt me. I'm an economist by training. I'll feel much more comfortable if you tell me I'm stupid and you stop me in the middle of sentences and so forth. I know we've got time set up at the end specifically for Q&A, and I'll respect that, but please chime in. So these girls, when assigned to female math teachers, believe that math is less difficult, aspire to different types of jobs, invest more in math tutoring, and do much better on math tests. We see no effects for either boys or girls who do not perceive themselves to be of low ability. And for boys who perceive themselves to be of low ability, we see some evidence that things go the other way. When they're assigned a female math teacher, they find math more difficult, and they invest less in math-related human capital. This is consistent with the psychological notion of identity threat. So here, you belong to a group which is supposed to have certain attributes, but if your membership in that group is threatened by information from outside, that can cause you not only to perform worse, but also to update your beliefs about yourself downward. So all of these pop out of the model that I talked about, and that's what we're going to go through first. But before we get there, I want to talk briefly about what we think we contribute and what we think we can't do. So in terms of contributions, we think first, the model we write down and the sort of intuition behind it formalize a commonly conjectured causal pathway from assigning teachers who share an identity with a group who faces a stereotype on that group's performance and persistence in given subjects. Michael?
Is it better for you if it's the student reacting to the teacher as opposed to the teacher choosing to invest in the student?
That's a good question. So we're going to try and disentangle those two possible mechanisms. Lots of papers have been written already that show that assigning a female teacher helps girls, particularly in STEM fields, and assigning a minority teacher in the US or an ethnic minority teacher in China or India helps ethnic minorities. What we think we contribute to this literature is providing some initial evidence towards disentangling these two things. What we're trying to say here basically is I don't think we've totally nailed it. For reasons that will become more clear as we go through the talk. But we hope that we can at least get a little traction. So we're actually going to use data on how often the teachers interact with each type of student, as well as a few other things to try and, again, get some purchase on that. So alongside the intuition, we think that along the lines of what I just said, we fill another gap in this fairly large literature of people studying the effect of teacher-student identity match in terms of understanding an intermediate outcome. So there's a lot of papers that have shown that if you get a girl teacher, you stick around longer in STEM majors if you're a girl. Or if you get a teacher who shares an ethnicity with you, you stick around longer and you do better in classes that that teacher teaches. What we know less about is how that affects your beliefs, how that affects your behaviors, and whether it's, as Michael suggested, the teacher being involved in your development or your response to that teacher as sort of a provider of information. And again, we're going to give some answer on that, but again, it's not perfect. And the reason it's not perfect is, one, we've got cross-sectional data. And so what we'd really like to see is many periods with observations of all these things over a long period of time. What we have is one draw, either from the middle of 7th or 9th grade. Secondly, because this is an applied microeconomics talk, there's tons of alternative explanations that are out there floating in the ether, some of which we've dealt with, but I'm hopeful that you guys will come up with some as well. And we want to be upfront that we don't think we've whacked every mole, so to speak. So how this is going to proceed is we'll talk about the conceptual framework, which we think is kind of a nice contribution on its own. We'll then go through the case that we use, Chinese middle schools, our data, and how we do our empirical analysis. We'll show our main results. We'll go through analysis of the different mechanisms we think are at play, along the lines of what Michael suggested, and then we'll wrap up. So first is the obligatory I stand on the shoulders of giants slide. We are not by any means the first people to have written on this. There have been a lot of great papers, both within and beyond education, on the theoretical issues at hand in investment under uncertainty. We build on the series in education. The closest to ours is this Jenico and Ray paper published in Econometric earlier this year. And empirically, there's been lots of work, again, on teacher-student identity match, but also a series of newer papers, some of which are written by people here at Chicago, that study the effect of providing different information to students or their parents on their investment in themselves. So Rebecca's paper in Malawi about helping parents update their beliefs about what the right level of course book for their children is a good example. But there's also a series of papers which, not to be pejorative, but basically show motivational speeches. You know, tell kids you can do it, or the returns are much higher than you think. And indeed, they find that dosing children or their parents with this kind of information can generate real behavioral changes. And so it's in the spirit of that we're writing our paper, but we think that we study an important vector of information which hasn't been covered yet, namely the teacher as role model. So the intuition behind the model is fairly straightforward. We have children who are uncertain about their ability and the returns to schooling. And the stereotypes they face affect their priors, what they believe about themselves, and how they update their priors going forward. We postulate that teachers can serve as role models. One, because they have frequent contact with the student, so you get to learn a lot about this individual. And two, because they sit in a position of authority, teaching difficult material. And so they have a role as someone who has made it, right? They give an example of what successful investment in oneself might look like, particularly to a group who might lack for that kind of example. So the work of William Julius Wilson, who as I understand it studies inner city youth in Chicago, suggests that one of the reasons why people may suboptimally invest in themselves, not invest as much as they could, is because they face uncertainty. And the uncertainty they face isn't about, well, with probability 0.5 I'll do really well, and probability 0.5 schooling is worthless, but rather uncertainty in the spirit of Frank Knight, another Chicago economist, where I don't know the different probability distributions, right? I don't know what the factor loading is on the successful outcome of the world. And maybe I don't even know it exists at all, right? Everyone around me are people either who don't have high levels of education or who have high levels of education but don't have high returns to education, then I'm going to incorrectly infer what the returns to education are. And so the role of the teacher who shares an identity with the student is to give them one more draw from the distribution to help them get a better idea of what the distribution of possible outcomes is for them. So the identity of the teacher is going to matter, coming straight from information theory, because a teacher who looks more like you is going to be more credible. And we're going to predict that the largest updates in beliefs about your own ability and the returns to education are going to happen for children who are on the margin of quote-unquote giving up on themselves in a way that will be made clear in a few slides. So it's going to get economics-y for a second. For those of you who aren't economists, I apologize. Do you have a question?
Yeah, just on the previous slide. So you only did on gender, but do you know if there's any studies that cross an intersection of NCC gender and CS?
So we would like to do that. I mean, one of the pieces of unfinished business in this paper is we only have gender in our data because China doesn't have a lot of homogeneity in ethnicity, particularly in a nationally representative sample, right? It's like 93% Han. And so other papers have suggested that in the US and in India, this matters. This, I think, is just our conjecture, but it seems to make sense. But in this paper, empirically, we're not going to say anything about it. In terms of the model, I think everything carries through. All you need is a subgroup who faces a stereotype. We're kind of agnostic, at least in the theoretical part, about who that is.
So one explanation involves this identity idea. The other would be the the quality of the feedback you get from someone is better. In other words, that a female teacher might give better quality feedback, have higher expectations that lead to better interactions, instructional interactions with girls than would be the case if the teacher were male. So the role model idea sort of strongly favors the identity explanation, just it's a person like me, as opposed to the idea that there's actually some kind of instructional interaction. Can you want to comment on?
Absolutely.
Maybe you're leaving both of them open, or?
No, we would like to be able to disentangle the two entirely. We're not able to at the moment, but we go to some length to try to provide evidence which suggests which of the two to favor. I don't think we want to say that only one or only the other. I think the evidence against the teacher acting in a different way includes the fact the classrooms are regulated very carefully. Right? We're going to compare within a school between classrooms within a grade. And so the examples that are used in the textbook and the material that's taught in the course are tied down fairly tightly. And so, one possibility is that, and then there's empirical evidence to suggest this, that in some cases, female teachers use examples which are more likely to generate enthusiasm among women. And male teachers are more likely to use examples which are more sympathetic to them and more likely to generate enthusiasm among men. We think in our particular setting that is unlikely to happen, but it still could be the case that teachers act in some unobservable way that is better for girls and worse for boys. And we can't totally rule that out. What we can rule out, at least to a first approximation, is that the teachers are doting on girls more, and particularly on low perceived ability girls. So we see no evidence that these girls are called on more frequently or praised more frequently. But we want to be very careful that there's a lot of stuff that we don't see. In an ideal world, we do what Norbert Shady does, which is videotape every hour of class for an entire year and hand code what happens. We're not there. So in terms of a model, we've got a very simple setup. 2-period consumption model. You've got income in both periods. If you want to save now to consume more in the future, you can. And the way that you do that is by investing in your own human capital. The return you get on that investment is uncertain. It's a function of how smart you are, which you observe imperfectly, but also the things that you encounter in the world. And this is where we're going to get stereotypes coming in. And students perceive the world as Bayesians, and they update their beliefs about their own ability, which is isomorphic with the returns that they get on investing in themselves, based on what they come in contact with.
So are the gross rate of return on the investment or the cost of funds to make the investment?
It's going to be the rate of return on the investment.
You have an interest rate on the slide.
Right, thank you. Slide 12. So the comparative statics that we're going to look to in this model are, one, how beliefs change in response to encountering a role model, who's we're going to say is a plausible example of high returns to investment. And two, how investment changes with a measured change in beliefs.
So the way this is going, this is coming out of the discreteness of Flynn's model. So you're either an investor or not an investor. And so your first slide is saying that it's these people on the margin of giving up. They are marginal, and everybody else is inframarginal.
Right.
There's the people who are going to invest without the encouragement, and the people who aren't going to invest under any circumstances.
That's right.
Okay.
So here is graphically what Derek just said. So on the x-axis, you've got the return on investment, not the interest rate. And on the y-axis, you've got your investment level. And so the unconstrained choice function is going to give you some optimal amount of investment in yourself based on the interest rate and intertemporal substitution. And we're going to assume that this hits the x-axis at some point, so there's a positive support of Ri, where what you'd like to do is borrow against the future. You think my return on investment is so low, I'd rather consume now. And we're going to assume that you can't do that. And so the optimal savings rate is going to be the upper envelope of the x-axis and this unconstrained choice function. Now where we link it to that Jenico and Ray paper is we assume that there are some people here erroneously. So because of stereotypes or stochastic error, you get a bad test score that's just a fluke, you believe you're here, but actually you're somewhere here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to study updating behavior around this neighborhood of R lower bar. Have I lost anyone yet? All right. So, yeah, please. No.
Shouldn't there really be an asymptote that can it really go below zero? And the function will.
So it could if you think, I mean, I think this is probably borrowing too much from, macro 101.
Somebody put a polynomial in where they really wanted to have something.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, it depends on whether it's the gross or the net. If it's the net,
Right.
of course it would go below zero because you don't learn enough to make up for the time that you lost.
yeah.
So it depends on the definition of R.
That's right. I should be clear about that. What I had in mind is that this is benefit minus cost. And so as cost goes up, yeah, you'd rather, lend your time to somebody else.
It'd be good in presenting this to say, people did this with savings.
Just a few people.
I'm not going to call S savings. I'm going to call S study.
Thank you.
And the question is, how much time am I going to allocate beyond what's mandated by the teacher? How much am I going to give at home? How much am I going to give, kind of beyond the amount of attention that she can mandate? And so we can think of S as kind of study effort, and we can normalize zero to the amount that she can force you to do just because you're in class. And the question is, do I give any additional study effort? And it's going to be shaped by what I believe the return to doing so is. And what you're saying is we want to model having a female teacher for a young woman as shifting in a first order stochastic dominance way their beliefs about the R that is associated with every choice of S.
That's a great way to sell it. Thank you very much. That's exactly right. So certainly we aren't the first people to write down this graph with R and S. And I think normalizing that to zero is really nice. So we're now going to study updating. And to make it even simpler, we're going to break down the support of Ri into below R lower bar and above R lower bar. And so we're going to assume that you're either L if you're below R lower bar or H if you're above. Everybody starts with a prior, which is their best guess about whether or not you're H. And we're going to assume that that H gets updated over time. And importantly for us, we're going to assume that it's informationally related to the likelihood that you encounter a teacher who shares an identity with you. So this is where you could substitute gender for ethnicity or for CCS. Pick an identity part, right? That Akerlof and Cranton thing is also pretty agnostic about what identity we're after. So we're going to assume that if you see a teacher who shares an identity with you, that tells you that you're more likely to have high ability than not. And so what that gives us then is a right-skewed inverse U relationship between your prior, what you thought you were beforehand, and your update, how much you change your belief in response to encountering a same-gendered teacher. So straight out of information theory, if you're sure you're of low ability or you're sure you're of high ability, seeing a teacher who looks like you does absolutely nothing. Your prior stays exactly where it is. If you're in the middle, it changes a little bit. And that last assumption we put on there just means that the peak of this graph, your biggest update, comes to the left of P of H equals 0.5.
Because you're going to be doing this for ages, I think it would be good in future research to where you got rid of this discreteness and you made the model more continuous and you tried to ask questions that actually elicited this uncertainty. So you would start off by asking students how they perceive their math ability, and then, if somebody who's good at this stuff, to give you the right way to phrase, are you sure? Because in a more continuous version of this model, it's going to be the people who are kind of a little below average in their perceptions and have a very diffuse prior. Those are the people you can move with the new signal. And so I think there's follow-up work to try to, to focus on both this location aspect, but also the diffusion of the initial prior aspect. Because your words are all about uncertainty and learning and new signals. But really the math is just about shifting a whole distribution of beliefs.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an artifact of the fact that our data is also discrete. And yeah, absolutely. I'd love to do something that's more continuous and gives us a little more power. Thank you. So we're now going to introduce stereotypes formally. And we're going to add an assumption that there's a wedge between girls and boys, or in stereotype-facing ethnic group versus out of stereotype-facing ethnic group, in terms of their prior. So if you're not facing a stereotype, you're going to think you're of high ability at a higher rate than if you are facing a stereotype. And dropping straight out of that in Bayes' rule is that people who are in the stereotype group are going to be more likely to respond to gender match under some very soft assumptions about basically not being here. So that gives us a set of predictions that we're going to take to the data. So for low perceived ability girls who are sufficiently close to our threshold, our kink, we predict that being dosed with a female math teacher is going to cause them to update their beliefs about the return on investment. The return on investment. That, if it edges them beyond the kink, should induce them to increase their investment. And to the extent that either of those things is correlated with performance, it should also increase performance. But note that this could go the other way. Right? If you're a boy and you're above the kink, but sufficiently close to it, being dosed with a female teacher can cause you to reduce your belief about the perceived interest or a perceived return on investment. And that could, depending on where it is, cause a substantial reduction in your investment in yourself.
Although this gives you leverage on
So this is what we're going to take to our data. So Darnell, how am I doing on time?
30 minutes.
30 minutes, great. I won't use it all. All right, so we're going to study middle schools in China. And this is useful for the reasons I gave before, but also because there's a large jump in the difficulty of math when you go from primary school to middle school. And so what that means is prior is going to be ripe for updating, right? If you thought you were doing really well in math, and all of a sudden you get slammed with a really hard question, it's going to cause you to reassess your priors and reassess whether or not you were right. As I said before, we've got random assignment of children to classes because of a law passed in the mid-aughts, and the Chinese instructional system being such that sending children on to really good high schools gets teachers promotion. And so in the 06 or something, the Chinese government said, stop it. And so in a lot of schools, not all, but in a lot of schools, we have as good as random assignment of children to classes. Go ahead.
So you have random assignment of students to teachers, there's also random assignment of students to each other?
Yeah, so my co-author has a paper in Economic Letters that shows the pure effects stuff that would drop out of what you suggest. If you want a good explanation of this, Le Shui He at Bates has a really nice paper that kind of walks you through the different assignment mechanisms, and he's great.
Tell us a little bit about the state of gender stereotypes in China, as well as the percentage girls.
Yeah, so I am learning, as a result of this paper, I learned a lot about it. In our data, both boys and girls are more likely than not to respond to a question, do you believe that boys are better than girls at learning math? Yes. And the low perceived ability girls that we study here are particularly likely to agree with that statement. Girls are also more likely to believe themselves to be of low ability, despite, again, that they do at least as well on tests. I can't speak to the larger societal milieu. I think that's probably not my comparative advantage anyway. But I think there's been lots written on it that's quite good, and we cite some of that in the paper, and that's where I'd point you. So the data we use, I'd highly recommend. It's the CEPS. It's run by people at People's University, and it's modeled on ad health. So it's got lots of exciting data on teacher characteristics, on student characteristics, on aspirations, on time use, on attitudes. And this is the data that we're going to use. We only have the first panel, and so like I said, this is going to limit our ability to talk about the dynamic effects of teacher assignment. So our identification strategy is to treat the assignment of students to the gender of their teacher as good as random within a grade within a school. And the balance tables to support this assumption are in the back of the paper. We're going to focus particularly on low perceived ability girls and boys because that's what comes out of our conceptual framework. Our estimating equation is a giant plate of spaghetti, and I'm very sorry for that. But what we lack in clarity here, we hope we make up for in clarity in our tables. So there's two ways to do this. One is to estimate the effect of being a female student, being paired with female teacher, separately for the low perceived ability girls and the not low perceived ability girls. We get a larger sample size and thus more precision if we put them together and just interact this low perceived ability indicator with the female student and female teacher indicators. But all of our results carry through if you instead want to cut the sample by this group and then estimate things separately. But so what we're going to study here is this gamma 3 coefficient. So what's the effect of being a low perceived ability low perceived ability student who's a girl who's assigned to a female teacher? And our interpretation is that netting out fixed effects for grades within schools, as well as student and teacher gender, how does being assigned a female math teacher change girls' outcomes relative to boys?
You're also going to show us beta 3, though, right?
Oh, yeah, we're going to show you beta 1, 2, 3 and gamma 1, 2, 3. So that's
What is beta 3, 0, and gamma 3?
exactly right. That's exactly where we're going with this. And that's one of the things that differentiates us from previous papers. A lot of people have shown big beta 3s not estimating these gammas. And we're going to say that gamma is really where the action is. So this brings us to the empirical results. We're going to first look at beliefs and aspirations. So first, how difficult you find your current math class, and then what jobs you aspire to. Then we're going to look at how likely you are to enroll in math tutoring at two different levels to try and tease apart the high and the low end of the aspiration distribution. And then we're going to look at performance on midterm math tests that are administered to every student in a school and standardized so we get nice, clean measures of ability. So first, this is what most of the tables I'm going to show you are going to look at. And so along the lines of Derek's point, this column is the betas, this column is the gammas. And we're going up like Donkey Kong, so beta 1, gamma 1, beta 2, gamma 2, beta 3, gamma 3. So this is the effect, this is the, what it means to be a girl on whatever the outcome is. The outcome is going to be listed down here. This is for low perceived ability girls. This is just getting a female teacher. This is getting a female teacher if you're low ability. This is getting a female teacher if you're a female student, and there's that interacted with low ability. So we're going to focus on this coefficient. This is gamma 3. Of secondary interest is gamma 2. That's going to tell us what happens to the boys. Right? Because
Boys that don't think they're low ability?
the omitted category is boys that think they're low ability. So that's going to be this. So so we can go back to that. So we've got female students, female teachers, female students and female teachers, and that interacted with low perceived ability. We don't have, I'm sorry?
Low, if you're low, zero.
Exactly. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. Yeah, no, Derek is right. I'm wrong. Derek is right, I apologize. That's right, thank you. Appreciate that.
Just always want to know what all of this, so all of these are compared to
Right.
a baseline of boys,
Right.
all of them.
Most of the world's problems. No, and I'm going to do a lot showing you distributions of data because this is a giant spaghetti monster, and I want to make sure that you don't think I'm kind of pulling the wool over your eyes. All right. So first, we're going to look at the effect of being paired with a female teacher on students' perceived difficulty of the current math class. So the prompt is how difficult you find your current math class. And it's going to be 1 for very difficult and 0 for somewhat, not so, or easy. And this is ultimately why we've got this discrete nature, that kink in our regression functions. I think Derek's idea of pulling down something more continuous would be great. So what we see here is, like I said before, girls are more likely to find math difficult. And having a female teacher overall, that gamma 2 seems to suggest that it may make low perceived ability students find it slightly more difficult. So this is the ancillary prediction. But the main event is up here. So girls who are assigned to female teachers who think they're of low ability are 20 percentage points less likely to think that their current math class is hard if they get a female teacher. And like Derek said, our beta 3 is 0. Right, so in previous papers, you see a big thing here, but this column is kind of missing. And we think that we get a lot of purchase on adding that and understanding exactly whom this is working for.
You should add these things up and then present the total. So if I am a girl who thinks I have low ability and I have a female teacher, and we want to compare me to this baseline cocky 7th grade boy, I've got to sum up a bunch of coefficients to know the total difference.
Yep.
And I think it would be easier to present this if you had the sums for different, and then people could do these differences themselves by looking at the sums. But it's very hard for us to know whether this total difference between this type of girl and the boy who thinks they're good is statistically significant because we've got all these different terms and all these different covariates.
You're absolutely right. So we've had some hair loss thinking about which comparison to show, because you can show a lot of them. And the one I think we're most interested in is the one that comes in a couple slides, which is looking at just low perceived ability kids. Right? If these are the vulnerable kids, we're really interested about boys and girls assigned to male and female teachers. And then I think the comparison to the cocky boys is tricky because they're fine. They're getting lots of care from their parents and they're doing well, and you could hit them with a truck pretty much and they're going to be all right. Stephen?
One way to do that is just to have a no-intercept model and have two equations.
Yes.
One for low, one for high.
That's a
And then I
good
think that-
idea.
then it would really pop up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all very helpful. Hopefully the data stuff, the out of regression stuff we show you here in a second will give you a little bit more intuition into how the data looks. So if you look at perceived ability across those 4 possible responses for each possible student-teacher gender pairing, this is what it looks like. This is the entire sample, and the yellow bar are girls assigned to female teachers, and you can see that compared to the lightest gray bar, girls assigned to male teachers, girls assigned to female teachers see that this is much less difficult. And interestingly, you see that boys assigned to male teachers find it slightly more difficult. Man, it's only 3 or 4%, but it's not what we predict. However, when you restrict the sample to only the low perceived ability kids, both predictions are borne out. So this is what I was telling Derek. We really think the comparison of interest is just looking at the low perceived ability kids, the same 4 gender pairings. You see that girls assigned to female teachers are 20 percentage points, just like the coefficient, less likely to find math very hard. And boys assigned to female teachers are between 8 and 10 percentage points more likely to find math very hard, which flips from the previous graph. And so I think this is kind of evidence that who you choose as your comparison group makes the conclusions you draw from this table different. So the next thing we're going to look at is aspirations. So here, the prompt is, what do you most wish to do when you grow up? Or what job do you most wish to have in the future? And like any aspiration question, it's terrible. And the closest, cleanest break that we got out of it is picking jobs which were traditionally associated with women and everything else. So this variable is 1 if you say designer, actor, or artist, and 0 if not. So consistent with that choice, you see girls are much more likely to pick these jobs, and low perceived ability girls are even more likely to pick these jobs. But again, you see beta 3 is 0 and gamma 3 is negative, right? So low perceived ability girls, when assigned a female teacher, are much less likely to aspire to these traditionally female jobs. Michael?
Which category is teacher?
Ooh, good question. I think teacher is somewhere in here. So you're absolutely right that it could induce them to be teacher. We tried teacher, but because it's mushed in with something else, like, I think this is one answer. So I think it's like teacher or doctor or something.
Another interaction is just work out the same way. No SEX, no self-esteem, you name it, I mean, they would find immediately. And then you think, oh, what's happening in the home? How is this kid being treated in the home? And what are the parents and the positive teachers being done? So are you going to elaborate on this like this? And showing us that these interactions turn out to be 0 if we have this with no parental education principle? Because now we're seeing aspirations to be knowing what the students are doing. Maybe what we think about is just the kids who come from very low education background. Not understanding that.
So it's quite possible that there is something that goes into low perceived ability, right? So low perceived ability is your response. Did you think that 6th grade math was hard? And we are completely agnostic about what that is. It could be low SES. It could be distance to school is far. It could be, I could spend a lot of time guessing about what that is.
You're just going to say thanks.
Thank you.
If the story is these are kids from homes where parents don't have a lot of education, and you go one step further and say it's very natural to believe that uneducated parents have less information about what the returns to human capital investment are because they operate in social circles where they don't have a lot of friends who went off and got advanced degrees, then if you did what she asked and you got the results she conjectures, it would be evidence that the information, it would be further evidence that's consistent with the information channel that you're pushing. Because you're not pushing the idea that it's just an emotional reaction to seeing someone who looks like you. You're saying it's information about expected returns from investment. So if you did this and it turned out the way that she's guessing, it would be better for you.
Yeah, with that in mind, I'll say thank you. I don't have anything pithier to say than that. I'm happy to talk more about it, but I think...
But it may not be only in that direction. Because if this is emotional response only. And you would see, for instance, children who come from higher educational backgrounds.
We control for income.
And then, because there are kids with very low self-esteem, and they come from high SES families as well. And if this is an emotional response only, then you should see this in high SES families as well, which have these, the information for the information. It would be just very interesting to understand this. Is it the emotional response or is it the information? Psychological versus of information.
Part of the question is, are these things correlated with
Right.
perceptions?
Is there a genetic factor to the relationship between the girl and the female student? A genetic factor that would not work as well with a male student? Have you considered it?
I hadn't. I'll think about it. I think that's the kind of question that I would need more time to think about to give you a good answer. Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to read about it. I don't know anything about that.
That there is an emotional factor, a genetic factor, that basically connects a female with a male student, but does not connect the same way as a male.
Thanks. And yeah, I wish I had a better answer for yours, but I'll look into it. All right, so the next thing I do is enrollment in math tutoring. So we have here again is an on-off thing. Are you enrolled in any math tutoring? And we see the same pattern. Beta 3 is 0, gamma 3 is positive, gamma 2 is negative, right? So this is basically low perceived ability boys go down and high perceived ability girls go up. I'm sorry, low perceived ability girls go up in their enrollment in tutoring when dosed to the female math teacher. So one criticism you might throw at this is, isn't this just the parents, right? Could this be a compensation story or a reinforcement story? And while we can't totally rule that out, there's evidence from China that suggests in middle school, kids are very involved in making their own educational decisions. So Scott Rozell's group has a couple papers on this where you dose kids with information and they choose to drop out at higher rates if you tell them that the returns to high school are what they are, which are not very great. And anecdotally from my co-author's school, he's had his office neighbor's daughter come to the mother and say, look, I really need more math tutoring. I need to do this better. That's not a perfect answer, but I think it's at least an existence argument that kids are involved in the tutoring that they get in middle school. The next thing we look at is math Olympiad tutoring. So this is tutoring at a higher level to compete in tests that are administered nationally. And if you believe our argument, you shouldn't expect to see anything here, and indeed we don't. So gamma 3 is a strong 0, suggesting that the girls that we're looking at aren't likely to be involved in this kind of tutoring, which is in line with some of your question to the extent that this is correlated with higher SES families. The fact that we see no action on it suggests that it's not just emotional. Consistent also with the existence of stereotypes. Despite the fact that girls' math performance is at least as good as boys, we see girls are much less likely to enroll in math Olympiad tutoring than boys. So the next thing we're going to, go ahead, Dolly.
Depends on the timing though, because there have been various policy changes related to this tests and to what extent they are counted for performance and so on, which would affect also.
That's a good point. Yeah, well, we should know more about those policies. So the next thing we're going to look at is performance on this midterm exam, which is again going to be administered to all students in a middle school and standardized. Mean is 70, standard deviation is 10. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you the distribution of scores. And so what we see here again for the 4 different teacher-student gender pairings is the difference we'd expect. Girls who are assigned to female teachers do better than all other teacher-student gender pairings, and it's here in the kind of middle left of the distribution. A Kolmogorov-Smirnov test can reject the quality of this distribution and any of these 3, or these 3 mushed together, but can't reject any of these 3 and either 1 or 2 of the others. So if we want, we can put this in regression form. and doing it the way that other papers would, getting rid of the interaction stuff, just looking at quantile regressions, we see an estimate for beta 3 which shows exactly what we saw in the distribution. So it's the left or the first quartile where all of the benefits come in terms of teacher-student gender match.
Big standard here is saving, but
Yeah, well, that's right.
you don't really want, you want that thing to turn down.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact
This picture doesn't match the model.
that's
The,
right.
you know, the people who decided to lose it, you know, they're way down at the bottom, they're not, your model would say that they shouldn't have responded. You know, the 5 percentile kid should have been unaffected by this given the logic of your model.
So I think, and I'm going to get over my skis here, so feel free to slap me down, but I think you're assuming that the low perceived ability, but incorrectly so, are all kind of in here. And I think I'm making a milder assumption that they're kind of sprinkled throughout.
Yeah, but I think you know enough about that. You know, the way the curriculum changes between middle school and high school. These kids that are truly at the second or third percentile, they have almost no chance of making it on to high school because they can't handle the work. And so, especially in China, given the way the curriculum changes between 6th and 7th grade, I'm not saying it validates the whole paper. I'm just saying I think you should be upfront with your readers that the model doesn't really match what's going on at the 5th quantile here. The graduation rates for those kids
Are pretty low.
are incredibly low.
That's right. That's right. So what I would say, and this is kind of a cheap way to lead into my next slide, is this isn't the thing we care about. What we really care about is that same table I've been showing you, right? Because this is an imperfect measure of perceived ability. There are some people here who aren't doing so great, and I'm going to stop that sentence because I didn't like where it was going.
What I'm saying, I think this, going back to your comment, this is the picture that says that it is more about emotional connection than it is about information. That there's a response among these very low achieving kids that you can never rationalize through your model that comes from seeing someone that looks like them in front of the class. Or the someone like them in front of the class treats them differently because they're more attuned to, you know, to the plight of these kids. But, you know, this picture is at odds with the model and is supportive of the alternative story that was brought up a few minutes ago.
That's right. And I have two things to say about that. One is I don't want to rule out that alternative story. I think I like my model. I think it's right, but I don't think that's the only thing that's going on. And so if I've come off as saying we're the only story in town, I apologize. That's not what I think, how I think the world works. However, notice that this is between 0.1 and 0.25 or something. When you go in, this is not as precise as we want to be. If you look at just the low perceived ability kids, it doubles. And then you get a much, much bigger boost. And you see beta 3 is 0. And so while I'm not saying that this emotional thing doesn't exist, what I am saying is we get more precision by looking at these kids who think they're of low ability. And we see some evidence that boys get pushed down, but it's not significant. So at least it's inconsistent with this compensation reinforcement story insofar as the movement on tutoring for boys and girls is about the same in magnitude. But the movement on test scores is very different. And how I read that is that there's an effort and an enthusiasm thing on the part of the student which has to pull into this if you think that tutoring linearly maps to performance.
It shows that you're getting that among little girls that have no chance.
Yeah, I think.
And you know, we saw the same thing Diane and I did in the Chicago Public School data. There were kids that responded or that made improvements under No Child Left Behind that had no chance really of being. You only had to. The ones that were left behind literally had 0, but there were people with a 15% chance of becoming proficient who had significant gains.
Right.
And so, you know, I think it's something to highlight that these effects can produce learning and human capital that's valuable even among people who aren't going to finish junior high and go to high school in China. And it can change their life, and that they can have a better blue collar service sector job because they can, you know, read the manual and do basic arithmetic.
That's great. I hadn't read that into this graph until now. Thank you. Question?
So, the career competency describing what they mentioned in the higher barriers to entry for female teachers and the like as a result of these like disadvantages they're having, so that those that are making it in are particularly high ability. And so I'm wondering, like, what do we have selection? What are the possibilities for like selection on ability, so that maybe these women are particularly good at reaching disadvantaged students, just in general, and if we have males that are.
It's a great question. We do a lot of that in a few slides, but in the balance test, we show that within a grade, within a school, the teachers are observationally equivalent. So yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, so quite a few more slides to go.
No, actually, we can breeze through them. So in the mechanisms, I've been pushing the story that the information provided by a same-gendered teacher drives the effects we observe. But there's a bunch of alternative explanations, and you probably have some more yourself. One is that these female teachers either give more attention to these girls or they spend more time on them, so they're actively involved in their development. Another possibility is that these female teachers are just better, that they use different methods, they're more skilled, there's something else going on. We have tests for those that I'll show you in a few slides. Things that we can't rule out totally are this parent compensation thing I was talking about, and unobservable differences in teaching content. So in the absence of a video of the class, which is diligently hand-coded, there's always going to be a boogeyman in the room that we're not going to be able to totally exclude. So for attention and effort, we estimate the effect of teacher gender on praise and attention that the student receives, but also teacher effort proxies to see if teachers who work harder benefit these low perceived ability girls more. For teaching skill and methods, we replace girl and female with girl and award-winning teacher. And so the idea there is that China has these national awards that are representative of teaching skill. And so we want to know, is it the case that skill generates these same benefits for low perceived ability kids? Finally, we just have different teaching methods. Lecturing, frequently using group discussion, frequently interacting with children, and we want to see if that brings up the same benefits. So for praise, using the student's response, the teacher praises me frequently in class as the outcome. We see no effect of being paired with a female teacher on the frequency of praise that low perceived ability girls receive. Nor do we see that female teachers praise students any differently. We see a similar set of results for how frequently the student is called on, and again, no big difference for female teachers overall. For teacher effort, we have a proxy for effort, which is how many hours they spend preparing and grading homework as a proportion of their total hours in class. Again, no evidence that low perceived ability girls benefit disproportionately in terms of their test scores from receiving a teacher who works harder. For skill, we use this award-winning teacher thing. Again, we see no movement. In fact, it goes the other way. For using group discussion, again, no movement, goes the wrong way. For another teaching method, same pattern. And that's the end of our mechanisms. So we want to end briefly talking about limitations. I've given you our interpretation, but we can't fully rule out a number of boogeymen. One problem we have is we only have one shot on goal. We only have one wave of data. And so we can't totally rule out a reverse causality story. So it may be that there's something else that increases test scores, and that's what generates the change in perceived difficulty and aspirations and investment. We think that we've thrown some stuff at that, and it makes that explanation unlikely, but we don't have a knockdown punch. I've said a lot about unobserved teacher attention, so I'm not going to go into that anymore. And we talked briefly about parent reinforcing versus compensating behavior. So to wrap up, we've been studying, I think the paper tries to study the impact of the informational environment that students face on their beliefs, aspirations, human capital investment behavior, and their performance in math tests. If you believe our results, I think that one takeaway is that there's a protective effect of providing teachers who share an identity to struggling students who face negative stereotypes in this specific way that we've laid out. Right? We're very proud of the model, and we think that that gives us some purchase on understanding how people update their beliefs. It would be nicer if it were continuous, and I think I've got some homework to do. In terms of economics, I think I'm preaching to the choir here and saying that our paper adds the chorus of voices which suggest that the informational environment plays a very important role in the process of human capital formation, and the stakes are just massive. There's this paper that came out earlier this year in Science which showed that between the ages of 5 and 7, among children in the States, gender stereotypes about what boys and girls should do begin to influence what boys and girls express interest in and what they spend their time on. Because of all the dynamic complementarity stuff we know, much of which has come out of here in Chicago, we know that these early decisions have massive import for the choices and the parameters of the decisions that people face in their early teens and in adulthood. And because more than half of all humanity faces some stereotype, either gender, ethnicity, or SES, we think the stakes are pretty hard to overstate. Thank you.